Good evening. This is Beth Martin Berkey, and I'm recording the first World Literature Online lecture, lecture number 1, which provides an overview of British imperialism as a context for the post-colonial literature that we'll be reading this semester. I want to begin with reviewing some of the context from last week, and you might want to go back and look at the lecture that is linked to week number 1. And I talked that in the evening about how to define post-colonial literature, particularly its connection to political independence from the colonization status of a European country. The other word was diaspora, and that is the location of the writer, whether within or outside, and diaspora is outside of the country. We also reviewed the 3 stages of post-colonial literature: the stage of writing a literature in English as a form of rebellion against the colonizer, but also literature at the time of independence and that moment of setting up a national identity. And more recently then, the literature of individuals, which is concerned about individual expression and issues. While the political is always present, it's not the front or the foremost concern of a novel. We also watched the Chimamanda Adichie TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, where Adichie talked about our human tendency to reduce experiences into an understandable narrative, and how that can sometimes become a single narrative that limits our understanding of others and ourselves. And she argues for the importance of stories and their impact on us and on a culture, but also for the need for multiple stories, especially in a context where a colonial country has dominated the imagination, the education, the resources and culture of a given country. How does a country come out from under that pressure and that impact of Western cultural and literary canon, which canon refers here to like an agreed upon set of important literary texts. Finally, we looked at inclusive criticism and how Adichie's talk really connects to Meineke Schipper's view of looking at a literary text in an inclusive way, not from our own lens and our own value system, but from the information and the values that are brought by the text, and then taking stock of what we know and what we don't know and using that as a basis for research. And that final step is what's really going to guide our work in this semester. So I wanted to build on a little bit more this more extensive colonial history of the British Empire. And again, we're focusing primarily on Britain, even though other countries like Spain and France, Portugal, the Netherlands, were all part of the sort of imperial expansion of the 15th through 19th centuries. But I'm going to focus primarily on Britain because those are the countries that we're reading books from. And so that's important for us to kind of focus in. But I think many of the patterns that we see in British imperialism are also ones that were replicated by other countries. At the same time, countries like Spain had a very, very different approach to colonization. And as you can look at South and Central America, and even the Northern America, parts of the US, Spanish colonization had a slightly different character and a slightly different impact as well. So a note at the top here, I've got British exploration, and that's often the narrative that we're offered, that this was a sort of like a natural outgrowth of scientific exploration and moving into the new, quote, frontier of other parts of the world. And often it's described as from the 1500s on, the exploration and colonization of the Americas, the Caribbean, the South Pacific, which included Australia and New Zealand, as well as the African continent and India. Now, the British, although they participated from the start, actually lagged behind the Portuguese and Spanish, and they competed with France and Netherlands for dominance, particularly in um, parts of Africa as well as the West Indies. But as you can see in this summary, it's important to keep in mind that exploration was really tied to needs for trade and economy, as well as issues of migration and settlement, sort of this theme of a better life and moving on to new opportunities and freedom, which is much of the narrative, the colonial narrative that defines what happened in what is now known as the United States. But when you think about the nuts and bolts of this, some of this is tied to wealth, the need for raw materials. When you look at where Europe is on this map of the globe, it's a very, very small area. And so the resources that environment provided were very limited. They did have things that they took to the rest of the world, and they also had things that they brought back. This movement of the exploration and trade and settlement was also a part of looking for labor, finding ways to produce larger quantities of things to exponentially increase profit. And there always is the exchange of goods. And there's also the element of politics. So the desire to expand colonies and establish new areas, get new land. This has elements of social dynamics in terms of class. And in many cases, the British government would give land grants to wealthy people or or different kinds of trade groups, and they would then come in and claim the land so that they could develop new areas and make money as well.